Hi, everyone. We're just about to get started. Thanks for joining us. Give it just one more minute to let people log in, and then we'll get started. Okay, well, it's a little after 3, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Caitlin Potus, and I'm the Secretary-elect for the Collection Stewardship Professional Network of AAM. I'm also the Registrar at Menge International Museum in San Diego. Today, you are joining us for another CSAAM webinar. We're going to hear from a couple folks about the updated general facility report. A couple logistics before we get started. I know we're not new to Zoom, but this is a webinar, so you guys can see us, the panelists, but we can't see you. Go ahead and use that chat feature to talk to the panelists or talk to one another. But if you have questions, make sure you use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen so that we can keep track as we go along for any specific questions. This webinar is being recorded and it'll be available on the CSAAM YouTube channel and probably our website as well. And I'll make an announcement when those videos are available. If you have any trouble with Zoom, there's a help center. I've written that down at the bottom, or you can chat to me or email me at my Menge email address. So this presentation has been given at a couple sessions already, one at the ARCS conference in the fall, and then another time at the online conference for AAM. And this time we're going to hear from a couple other contributors to the updated facility report. We have Darlene Bialowski, who is the principal at Darlene Bialowski Art Services. And she's also the former chair of the Registrar's Committee of AAM. Hallie Winter is also with us. She's the collection manager, registrar for the First Americans Museum in Oklahoma, and the former director curator of the Osage Nation Museum. And finally, Sebastian Encina, who's the collection manager at the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology at the University of Michigan, and also our chair for collection stewardship of AAM. And with that, I will hand it over to Sebastian to get us started.
Thank you so very much, Caitlin. Hi, everybody. My name is Sebastian Encina. I am the chair of the Collection Stewardship Professional Network of AAM. We made mention previously of the Registrar's Committee that was the precursor to Collection Stewardship, and that's what Darlene was chair of previously. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and actually for the second webinar this week. To begin, I want to give a brief overview of today's presentation. So Caitlin, if you can go to slide 4. So we are here to talk about the updated General Facility Report, an important document museums around the country and world use in order to share vital information about their own museum when planning for the loan of art, artifacts, and specimens. As Caitlin mentioned, we have two speakers with us today, Darlene Bialowski and Hallie Winter. Darlene will lead with an introduction to the GFR, its history, and reasons why it is important. Hallie will present on the changes to the GFR from the 2008-2009 version to the 2019 version. We will end today's presentation with an opportunity to answer questions from the audience. As Caitlin noted, there is a Q&A section and we will be monitoring that for questions. Though we will primarily answer questions at the end, if a question pops up that is relevant to the topic at hand, we will do our best to answer that question at that time. And Caitlin, next slide, please. A quick note, the updated General Facility Report 2019 is available through the AAM bookstore. We are providing the link here, and you can also search the bookstore on the AAM website. The GFR is available as a fillable PDF, so it's not a Microsoft Word anymore, a change from previous versions. The form is available for $19.95, and we will post a link to the bookstore in the chat, so you can follow the link at your leisure. And next slide, please. For those unfamiliar with the GFR, we are including here the description of the form from the AAM bookstore directly. At its core, it is a document that allows an institution to record important information about itself, specifically its physical status and staff practices. I say institution because the GFR is not necessarily only for museums, though it is advertised that way. Museums don't lend only to other museums. There are occasions where we lend to non-museum institutions, such as a library or a government building, etc. The new GFR, as you will see in a bit, allows for a greater selection of institutions to fill out for their own needs. Though primarily used for lending purposes, Darlene will explain why it's not just for loans. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Darlene. Thank you, Darlene.
Thank you, Sebastian. Caitlin, could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope the information we'll be sharing about the GFR gives you an idea of what changes you'll see with the 2019 edition, but more importantly, from my point of view, for those of you who have never completed one, or it's been quite some time, assistance in how to do that. Some simple tips, all said with a sense of humor. And since it's rarely discussed, I wanted to share a little of the backstory of how this document came to be and a little bit about its evolution of updates over the years. My name is Darlene Bialowski, and I'm a contract museum registrar as well as a fine and decorative arts appraiser located here in New Hampshire, but I travel all over the country. I'm always surprised at how many responses I get to questions about a colleague's facility report, and the consistent phrase is, but we don't borrow, but we don't lend. As a former chair of the former RC, I feel it's my responsibility to continually push word about the GFR to as many collections colleagues as I can because of its importance and because I know nothing else like it exists. It's a tool for multi-purposes. So let's get down to a little bit of that history. Things in the museum field seem to take a lot of time to conquer. The 1950s was a time of discussion to standardize loan procedures, chats between registrars and exhibition professionals. 20 years later, standard procedures started getting into place, but there was no one way to collect that information. A little here, a little there. Everyone had their own forms, their own checklists, some made sense, some didn't. Loan exchanges, particularly amongst the larger and typically art museums, started to increase, so there was a greater need to get information consistently together. There's an archival informatics technical report from the winter of 1988, which announces the establishment by AAM of the facility report after nearly 40 years of discussions and starts and stops. Ultimately, this meant that standard fields of information would now be available so everyone collected answers to the same questions. And it also led to standardization of exhibition contracts. Next slide, please. In the fall of 1988, the AAM published the inaugural Standard Facility Report, and everyone, for the time being, was happy. The miniature of the cover at the right of the slide shows its cover, plain and simple. Name of institution, a place for the lender to make comments, Notice how small that box is in today's theory of all the questions we typically ask about red flags. And then there were some interesting inclusions. The summary of attachments did not require all listed. You made an X at what you were attaching. Those 5 attachments were staff list, exterior photograph, photograph of storage area used for loans, floor plan with location of portable fire extinguishers and temporary exhibition space indicated, and your brochure. But really interestingly enough, were a set of instructions that followed that list. Instructions for completing evaluation form. To the borrowing institution, fill in all information requested. To the lending institution, questions providing key information begin at left margin. Questions providing more detailed information are indented. It was a simple 18-page document consisting of 8 sections of limited questions, all the basics we see in it today, except no page for signatures. Next slide, please. The 1988 report was a gem and was used by everyone who did some kind of major loan or if requested to complete from the lender. But then the more loan activity increased, the more questions were raised. So the FSR goes under the knife for a little nip here and a little tuck there, and in 1998 comes to life updated. Now it's 10 sections and 26 pages. There's a new cover which just rearranges institution information to have it on the front. There's now an insertion of confidentiality language of the report. Gone are the indent and left margin instructions. Now there's questions about your geographic location, an actual form for completion of staff information, more detailed questions about the staff's, more detailed questions about the building's envelope, check all that apply for materials used in more than just the walls, a rearranging of questions and expansion of sections. Section 9 is a blank page for comments, and Section 10 finally allows for party signatures. Next slide, please. So things go well for another 7 or 8 years, during which we as registrars don't remain quiet because we realize we're asking even more questions from the lender's point of view. CITES, the Smithsonian's Traveling Exhibition Service, at the time an organization with over 20 registrars, kept returning loan requests asking for more information or explaining to the borrower what the question actually meant and to please answer accordingly. Natural disasters were increasing in frequency and severity, fine art insurers getting nervous with claim settlements, so was it time to reevaluate? And while we're at it, let's deal with the misunderstanding of what the title Standard Facility Report actually means, since so many were purchasing the SFR thinking it was a report that was completed with the standard answers. Maybe it was time to consider a new name. Next slide, please. The early 2000s saw some devastating disasters. Ivan in 2004, Katrina, Wally, Charlie in 2005. But then the Montmartre warehouse fire in East London, May of 2004, is considered to be a starting point for greater scrutiny of risk management where artwork was being stored. Now the insurance industry began to realize something was amiss. Next slide, please. In case you aren't aware and think the facility report is just used by lenders to improve or reject your loan request, let me let you in on an additional user. Underwriters use the facility report as one tool in evaluating an institution's risk management. It, along with resources such as a museum's top 10 highest valued works or objects, total insurance value of the permanent collection, loss history, exhibition schedule, are the minimum requirements needed in order to obtain a fine art collections quote from a specialized insurance company. Your facility report actually becomes part of your insurance record. Increase in quantity and severity of natural disasters in the early to mid-2000s was one factor raising concerns from underwriters. They want to learn as much as they can about an institution and how it mitigates against potential loss, and the then SFR wasn't capturing the current needed information. That being, off-site storage facility numbers having had increased, greater use of below grade storage, disaster plans for those exposed to natural disasters, floods, hurricanes, and earthquakes weren't detailed enough, staff were not being trained, or plans were not being updated as necessary. Next slide, please. So the RCAM board meeting in Boston in 2006 was a big game changer. Christina Schwartz, head of Registrar of Sites, a board member, and then little old me, an invited guest, were in attendance. Chris made a statement that her registrars are spending a lot of time asking questions of the answers on facility reports, and could the RC look at discussing an update? Of course, she was immediately appointed chair to form a task force to determine if an update was needed. Fine art insurers, in the persons of Jeff Knapp from Huntington T. Block, who is the spokesperson for his industry, advised there were indeed more questions that needed to be included. Construction, renovation, additions were happening all over, those that were planned pre-disaster and those as a result of disaster repairs. Architects, environmental specialists, engineers were making movement in areas where questions did not yet exist to capture work being done and how it may change questions already being asked, or that the existing questions needed greater explanation. Next slide, please. So the task force issued a command for a committee, and the task force itself was dissolved in late 2006. The committee was formed with various represented parties from different types of museums, different associated industries. Many volunteered in the beginning, 2 handfuls were left by mid-project, and less than a handful 3/4 of the way through. Yet the tiny committee prevailed, and a Word document complete with name change was submitted to AAM in late 2007. Gearing up for the meeting's program, Chris and I were asked by AAM to do a session introducing the GFR. A Word document was released, as well as an Adobe version, just in the nick of time for the annual meeting in 2008 in Denver. The panel was such a success, we submitted to all of the regionals and attended 5 out of the 6 annual meetings with road trips sprinkled throughout 2008. Next slide, please. As with any major publication project under the gun on a variety of deadlines, the GFR was targeted for release by April 2008. But due to a few glitches nearing the date the printer needed the galley, the committee never saw the absolute last revision. The GFR is printed, published, released. AAM decided to release an Adobe version of the document, but in the more advanced edition that was currently available at the time. The committee started to hear from smaller institutions and some of the larger ones that the Word report was having issues and the Adobe version was a higher version than they owned. Could something be done? AAM asked that Chris and I go over the documents and advise what the issues were so that AAM could have them rectified. After quite some time, I submitted a 23-page side-by-side comparison report. It was evident that the translation of what was submitted and ultimately what was published resulted in some necessary tweaking, and the Adobe would be released in a requested edition of a lower version. Next slide, please. The GFR, like many a classic and beloved object, will occasionally need an uplift, with tweaking here and there, and current technology will dictate what's the most efficient software. With loan activity increasing in smaller institutions and university museums making their way through crafting their facility report, here we are 11 years later with this 2019 edition, as you will hear in the following discussion. It's a bit refreshed, a bit rearranged, and a bit more inclusive to continually push for a broader user base. Next slide, please. So, why should institutions utilize the GFR? If you consider what information the facility report includes, you'll realize it captures basically everything about your institution, inclusive of its building envelope. That information, once collected, is a treasure trove. Why limit it to use for only one purpose? It's a document to have all your institution's infrastructural data, security procedures, staff identification, insurance information, and environmental control details in one place, a glimpse at a moment of time. It's another holy Bible for the profession in and amongst its distinguished cousins, the MRM6, On the Road Again 2, and Young's Rights and Reproductions, and another of my top 10 favorites, Is It Okay to Sell the Money?, which covers the ever-present issue of deaccessioning and to which I contributed an essay on provenance. These and others should all be in your library. The facility report is your go-to source for valuable information captured once and maintained. Now it's easily updatable, whatever method you use. It should always be considered when any renovation or construction is about to be discussed, as it can be a cost savings tool. Besides, the insurance industry depends on them, so see it as a friend. Next slide, please. As you work to complete the form or update one that is already being used, you'll learn more about your institution and its working components. The detail about the building's climate control, how you use lighting, use of cases for exhibits, storage, your current situation, and perhaps your ideal setup. It can help you determine where priorities for improvement are, where the weaknesses or the strengths are. We'll talk next about how to complete it, but don't let the limit of the questions prevent you from including, at least in your desk copy, other valuable information you might have about the structure and its operations. It can be used to store historic information and customize to include other important details, such as, if it's a historic house, the list of prior owners, images of the building over time, floor plans or descriptions of what objects were in what rooms, what galleries, former staff list to see who was there, when, and what positions were held, sort of a growth chart in a sense. Above all else, as the slides indicate, and I'll say it more than once, it is confidential, so keep the completed copy secure. And now I turn the discussion back over to Sebastian.
Thank you so very much, Darlene. That's a lot of really useful information. The General Facility Report, Standard Facility Report has had such a life, and it's nice to have all that and be aware of the entire history of that. So thank you very much. And we will hear from Darlene again later on in the presentation. If we can go to slide 19. So now we're going to talk about what the changes are for the General Facility Report now. I'm going to start off with how it began and the process, and then Hallie will take over with the actual changes. So in 2018, AAM approached Collection Stewardship about editing the GFR. They had been hearing from AAM members that there were updates and edits they wanted to see. We also had been hearing about edits others wanted to see. I was chair-elect of CSAAM at the time, and then Chair John Simmons asked me to oversee this work. In order to make this a strong document, I made it a point to solicit help from a varied group of contributors. I reached out to staff working at art museums, history museums, science museums, Indigenous peoples museums, university museums, from large budget to small budget. We had registrars and collection specialists, but also people working with traveling exhibitions, conservators, independent museum workers, insurance specialists, and we even had the help of people overseas. Over time, some fell out, leaving the work to a smaller group, but we had the editors and several rounds of readers. We were fortunate enough to have two people who had worked on the previous iteration of the GFR as well, two people with great knowledge of how it worked and the edits previously made. Next slide, please. The process involved dividing the chapters between the contributors we had. The mission was to streamline, fix the language, add comments we had heard from members, while also keeping an eye out for ourselves where edits were needed. Each contributor took 2 sections to edit, though each was invited to review other sections as well. As editor, I took their edits and collated them into one document. I also made my own edits. When all was completed, I shared a document with various readers who came back with their own edits and suggestions. These were incorporated, and I gave a presentation at ARCS in November 2019 in Philadelphia. And then at that conference, I received even more feedback, which we were able to add to the document before finally turning it over to AAM in November 2019. We originally had a deadline of October, submitted it to AAM, then I had even more feedback, and AAM was nice enough to allow us to get even a last-minute version in there. So that is how that process began. Now we're going to get into what the actual changes are, and Hallie will now give the overview of those changes. So Hallie.
Ahoy, everyone. Hello again. My name is Hallie, and I am a citizen of the Osage Nation and of Oglala Lakota descent. And I'm honored to be with you here today. I send well wishes to you and your families during this difficult time of COVID, and I just want to thank you all for joining us. Like Sebastian said, it's important to note that the GFR is not new. It is updated. This is a living document that, as you have just seen, it has been tweaked and updated throughout the years, and it will continue to be updated for months and years to come. New content has been added, but much of it is the same. And today I'm going to give you an overview on some of the changes that were made. We won't touch on every single change because our time is so limited, but you will get an overview of what the changes were. So I approached the updates to the GFR based on my experiences at the Osage Nation Museum. The O&M is America's first tribally owned museum, and it's located in rural Oklahoma on the Osage Reservation. It was important for me to look at the GFR from a small museum perspective, as many of our small museums are run by limited staff, volunteers, and community members. And now I currently work at the First Americans Museum, which is on the other side of the gamut. The FAM is a 175,000 square foot facility that is currently being built. We should be opening in 2021, so come and visit us. But in all seriousness, this also allowed me to consider the GFR from an additional perspective, hitting home the fact that this document needs to be worked and accessible for a diverse set of institutions. A major goal of our GFR revision was to update this document so that it became less wordy and more intuitive. In doing so, sections were consolidated and even rearranged. We were able to cut down from 8 to 7 sections by removing redundant questions and moving questions in sections where they seem to make the most sense. We hope that these slight changes will make the form easier to complete. It is also important to note that we did not start a new document, but fine-tune the document that so many of us have become familiar with. Next slide, please. Another goal of the revision team was to change some of the language and terminology that was being used. The team set out to update terms, account for new technologies like LAD, and make the document as user-friendly as possible. We noticed that throughout the document, some of the questions could be confusing and hard to decipher by users, and by making small changes to the language, we could obtain the same information in a more succinct manner. We also wanted to be clear that the institution is the star of the show. You can see here, with a slight change in wording, we moved away from asking you questions to creating questions where the institution became the focus. By making these small changes, we were able to make the document less personal in nature and focus on the institution itself. Next slide, please. Clarity was also important to the revision team. Both the lender and the borrower should be comfortable with providing and receiving the proper information. So cue the checklist of attachments. This is another great example of our consolidation efforts. The 2008 form had checklists throughout the document, and they could easily be lost within the form. We moved checklists to the beginning of the document in order to provide a concise list of what can and should be included in your report. Most of this information was also provided in the 2008 report. We only updated the format. The first part of the checklist reminds the institution to include floor plans and climate readings. The length of time to monitor and share is up to the lender and borrower to determine. We are simply reminding the user that these attachments will most likely have to be prepared. This is also pertinent information to be found at the very start of the form. You will note that geographic location and natural disaster questions from the 2008 edition have now been formatted into a simple checklist. Because knowing whether a museum is in an earthquake, hurricane, or tornado zone is important to loan decision making, this type of information was moved to the front of the document. Lenders will not have to search through the form to find this information, and the borrower is also made aware of what they need to provide to a potential lender. Below this, we ask where the loan items will go. The 2008 form focused on loans going into temporary exhibition spaces, but the reality is much different. Loans can be placed in permanent exhibition rooms or may be used for research and study. This checklist acknowledges this, and if the borrower has other intentions, there is space allocated to note this. Finally, it is also good to be consistent with your units of measurement. And so we included here a checkbox to mark if your measurements were the English or international system. You can also see here at the very top, there is an option for the long or the short form. And I can tell you about the short form in just a second. Next slide, please. Because the GFR is such a bear of a document, we really wanted to provide a shorter option for users to complete. And at this time, the short form is the entire questionnaire minus the supplemental questions. While this wasn't a huge change, this does allow the borrower to only complete what is necessary. It also lets the lending institution know that sections are not missing, they were just deemed unnecessary. I think in the future, we plan to continue to work on the short form and maybe even make it shorter. But how do you determine if your organization needs to fill out the long form or the short form? In order to determine whether the organization will fill out the short form depends on the checklist shown here on the lower right-hand corner. This list asks if the borrowing institution is in a geographic location that meets any of these criteria: earthquake or earth movement, flood zones, hurricane zone, tornado zones, brush and urban interface zones, and whether the borrower will use an external or packing facility. Will they display items in locations other than their own premises, or will they intend to display items outside? If the borrower checks all of these, they do not meet this criteria and they can skip the supplemental section and complete the short form. If any of these boxes remained unchecked, then you must select and fill out the relevant set of questions in the supplemental section. Next slide, please. The supplemental questionnaires tie directly to the checklist that we just reviewed. If all boxes were marked, an institution does not have to complete these sections, but they also can if you want to. Please remember that communication between yourself and the lender is key to properly compiling the GFR. Many of these questions remain the same as the 2008 form, and while these questions were optional, the intention of the short form is to clearly show the lender that the questions in this section were not answered on purpose. If the borrower will use a packing or shipping facility and display items in their own space, then the supplemental questions relating to the external space must be filled. Some packing and facilities do have their own GFR, and those can also be submitted. Again, check with your lender, have those discussions before proceeding. And we always also recognize that museums are not always a single building institution. Many museums have multiple buildings or wings. You can use this form to discuss not only the building where you are housed, but also the building where the loan materials will be stored and displayed. If loan materials will be stored or displayed in separate buildings, it is important to either fill a form for each building or at least duplicate questions to speak about both. Be sure to identify which building the form is detailing if there is more than one. Next slide, please. And when thinking about the diversity of our institutions, we recognize that they come in all shapes and sizes. So another major edit we made to this form was to add in a greater section on parent institutions. Many museums, for example, are organizations within larger parent institutions, such as universities, businesses, or tribal nations. As a museum professional working for a sovereign nation, I saw how the GFR did not satisfy our needs or capture our information properly. You really want to let the lender know how your museum is structured. So we ask your institutions to complete this information both in the borrowing institution profile section and again in the general information section. Though it may seem a bit redundant, this allows for a little more clarification and confirmation. Here the form asks what types of organization the parent is, whether it's a university, a college, a corporation, or a municipality. This information is vital for loan considerations, as it tells the potential lender who they will be working with for the contracts, for shipping purposes, for care of the loan items, and for coverage in the event of emergencies. It also informs the lender the extent of potential support the borrowing institution will have to ensure the safety of the loan items. Next slide, please. The 2008 form had certain museum types that an institution could identify as. These types covered many museums that we normally think of when we think of museums, and most museums that use this form would be able to find their museum type in that list. However, we wanted to provide further clarification on the type of institutions that this document can apply to. Though many museums have language that they only lend to other museums, we recognize the truth that loans can go to other institutions as well. It is not only museums requesting art, regardless of whether the lender will approve the loan or not. For example, a university museum may be asked to lend art to a student union or offices or other spaces. Embassies, archives, or government buildings asked to borrow collections owned by museums. In order to make this document more inclusive, many more museum types and organizations were added in the hopes that these organizations will use the form and feel confident in doing so. Though we suspect some institutions who ask to borrow collections will not know about this form, we invite the users, our colleagues, to invite them to use this form and share this data with them. In this way, they can collect data they need to make an informed decision. And if those institutions ask for collections once, it is likely they will ask again, and we can provide them with the tools necessary for lending to museums or in borrowing from museums. I also just noticed that tribal museums are not listed here, and so that will be another update to come. Remember, this document is a living document and changes will continue to be made. Next slide, please. Our staff and support are the heartbeat of our institutions. In many cases, organizations do not have dedicated staff that tend to the HVAC systems, handle security, or other needs. Thinking back to small museums and museums that are run by volunteers, oftentimes these roles are covered by parent organizations or contractors. This new form includes language that allows the institution to indicate that those needs are covered, just not by the staff of the museum. In some cases, there is a department rather than a specific person who handles those tasks. The old form asked for museum staff responsible, but without those specific names, it appeared they did not have the proper coverage. Next slide, please. It is not only facilities and staff that is covered by the parent organization, but this can also apply to security. Some museums don't hire their own security, but rely on their parent organization to provide that support, or they may contract to an outside business. The updates to this form allow for a variety of security personnel and system options to be captured. While a regular rotation of security is ideal, staffing can fluctuate depending on availability and coverage needs. Security can also be connected to units outside of the museum, and alarms can be heard in a variety of locations. Alarms can still go to internal offices, but they can also go to the local police station or a company hired to monitor the system. But these additions provide for more possibilities. The new GFR removes the limitations that were set for this in the old version. Next slide. Moving on to insurance, having parent institution can also affect many aspects of our museum work. Even insurance is often covered by the parent organization to some level and not by a single insurance company. As a result, coverage for museums with parent organizations can appear different from insurance coverage for the standalone museum. For example, the Osage Nation Museum was a department under the Osage Nation, and our collections fell under the nation's insurance coverage. By our updates to this form, you can note that. This form does continue by asking for information about further coverage beyond self-insurance for museums without parent organizations. They will skip question 6.02a and go right to 6.02b, which is not shown here, but when you download the GFR, you'll be able to see that one. Museums without parent organizations can fill out both or one or the other, depending on the circumstances. Next slide, please. Earlier, we briefly spoke about the space that loan items may populate. And here is a space for us to go more in depth into this topic. The 2008 form was too limiting, forcing borrowers to only think of terms of temporary exhibitions in temporary spaces. Much of what we do is also in the realm of permanent exhibitions, but also for study and use. The 2020 form allows for the inclusion of any exhibition space for loan item display. Loans can and are displayed in the permanent exhibition spaces, and this new form is more flexible to anticipate these needs. Rather than confining the borrowing institution to only temporary exhibitions, the new GFR gives more freedom to cover all kinds of work the museum is engaged in. In addition to exhibition spaces, the form also covers any storage spaces in the event loan items do not go directly to the gallery or are not intended for exhibition at all. Instead, they might be determined to be going somewhere for research or study purposes. Next slide, please. We also recognize that many institutions have additional resources available to them outside of the museum property. Storage in other buildings where crates or art may be stored is a perfect example of this. The form now reflects that spaces outside of the museum are available, but still owned by the larger institution and cared for by them. While some museums may use a third-party art storage space, larger organizations may provide overflow space to museums to save on costs. This attempt to capture as much information as possible, regardless of location, was carried through several sections of the GFR. Next slide, please. As you can see, another type of additional space is the great outdoors. After my colleague Sebastian presented the GFR changes at ARCS in 2019, he received feedback about how to handle outdoor artwork with the GFR. It was then that we realized that this information was missing and couldn't be accounted for. We therefore added another set of questions to the supplemental section covering the display of outdoor art. This is not a situation that will affect all museums, but it is something that museums do work with. We want the GFR to be able to handle this and now have the questions that lenders can use. And this is a perfect example of working with our colleagues across the board and collaborating as a field together to provide information that is useful for all of us. Next slide. This attempt to capture as much information as possible, regardless of location, was carried through several sections of the GFR. Environmental control systems now ask for data from any space where the loan items will go, not just the temporary exhibition spaces. In this way, museums can differentiate between the different spaces and focus only on the space where the loans will go. The new edits also encompass other forms of climate control a museum may employ in order to regulate their spaces. Next slide. Further into the environment section, we continue to see language that is being used in order to ensure relevant information makes its way to the lender. Whereas the previous slide asked the types of controls a museum uses, these questions ask about the range. Depending on the spaces, temporary versus permanent, exhibition galleries may vary greatly. They can be in different zones, on different floors, or in different buildings altogether. This new form allows for such detailed information. Next slide. We even included the same language for fire and smoke detection, and the event systems differ between spaces. It is not for AAM to assume that an institution has uniform environmental and fire safety measures throughout their spaces. Depending on a number of criteria, a system or systems may be used in one space, and they may not match those elsewhere, particularly for museums with multiple buildings constructed in different years. Remember, not all questions on the form need to be answered, just the spaces your institution thinks are relevant for the lender to be aware of. If in doubt, communicate with your potential lender about how best to fill out the form. Today, we have seen some of the more larger changes made and a few examples of small changes. We did not want to tear down the document completely and start anew, but continue the work our 2008 colleagues put forth already. The GFR's built-in flexibility is not intended to confuse people or make the process more difficult. It is intended to give the institution more freedom in defining the terms that work for them. We really invite users to fill out the form as best as they can, as long as they're doing it in good faith. Use the tool as a means of communication and a dialogue with lenders. And this is also an important document to keep, to allow your staff, your collection staff, to understand the building space and the systems that are within that space. I will now pass the baton back to Darlene. Thank you for listening to me ramble today, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Hallie. That was so well done and so inclusive of many of the major changes that were made. So could we have the next slide, please, Caitlin? Thank you. So I know when I was first tasked with looking at the facility report, when I was at the Springfield Museums in Springfield, Mass, and I was sole registrar there, I was terrified. What in the world is this thing that no one wants to admit they can help with? But in the way of any good registrar, I figured out how to approach it and dove right in, managing the details, the questions needing answers, and how to get those answers. My goal was to figure it out, update the one that was in place, and then when there's time allowed, develop one for the other 3 museums that were part of the association, but which did not necessarily borrow or lend, but for which I wanted the information captured. The plan: use a blank copy, take it apart, tackle it in bits and pieces. If you're at an institution where there is a security department, facilities and grounds, etc., take those sections and ask the head of the department to assist you in its completion and give a deadline. If you are the sole person who is going to complete it, there is help out there, which I'll go into in the next slide. Once you've compiled all of the information and the document is complete, breathe a sigh of relief, but keep that fully completed form restricted to certain access: yourself, your director, your department head, to only those who really need to know the overall picture. Why? Now say it with me now, because it's a confidential document and should be kept secure. Well, maybe not under police protection as shown in the slide. Next slide, please. If you have read Angela Kipp's excellent publication, Managing Unmanaged Collections, which should be in your library, you'll know she's offered so many creative ways to get assistance from others, building community involvement that gets returned in so many ways. If you're on your own, starting from scratch but with familiarity of the document, or starting anew, don't worry. Answer what questions you can, color code if necessary, what ones you're sure about, which ones you need to check on, which you need assistance with. The questions on any of the zone identifications, if it's got to do with flood or earthquakes, call your insurance agent. Questions about the heating and plumbing? Is there a contractor you use? Call them. If there isn't one, ask around and see whose name keeps popping up and call. Invite for a coffee, offer a year's complimentary membership in exchange for assistance. Do the same with the fire department chief to answer the fire questions. Chief of police to answer the questions about response time and location of the nearest fire hydrant that would be used. And don't forget to ask, how often is that fire hydrant tested? Understand what pipes run through the ceiling of your basement. Have them identified. What pipes or vents might no longer be active but were never removed? How does the air exchange work? Do a walkthrough. It's important for you to understand your your building, so that you can make sure you understand the general facility report and all of its questions. Is your building a historic structure? Contact your state historic preservation officer. Is there anyone in the area, or ask for a referral for help? If it isn't historic, but is an older building, see what building contractor in your area, if you don't already use one, is experienced with such structures and invite him or her in for assistance. Use the GFR's checklist of attachments to guide you in what information to gather. Next slide, please. So now you have a completed GFR. It's time to celebrate and take a moment to relax. But your work does not stop there. Some information will change over time. And a tip from me is to take a copy of that completed report, break it into sections, and with dividers, house it in a 3-ring binder. Into the binder, add notes, memos, post-its about changes as they occur, new staff, gallery reorganization, changes in security, access to storage, etc. You might think you'll be able to remember, but don't burden yourself when there's a simple way to manage that information. Stick it in the binder and update it later. Add into the binder information you can't figure out where else to file. At least for now, it's with related information. Determine a maintenance schedule. Every time you seek to borrow, once a year, in December or next January, decide when to update it. Don't depend on having a copy only on your computer. Don't store it in the cloud, but if you must, have another copy on a local server and on a flash drive. Why? Because it's a confidential document. And here I will share with you a very scary point. A recent Google search that I did led me to find more than one completed facility report on the internet. And I did know of one that was uploaded in a members section of a regional museum association, though the facility report was an older version. It still doesn't matter, it's confidential. Any copy put online will show anyone who knows where to look. All of that confidential information, your institution's vulnerabilities are right there in print. Don't think that there aren't individuals out there who know what to look for, where to find it, and will use it. Next slide, please. So, like me, once you've managed to work your way through from beginning to end, you'll be relieved and rather pleased with yourself. Don't be intimidated. If you're tasked with completing one, it's only a document full of questions. And I know some of you hate the fact that it's so long and there are so many questions, but honestly, it's just a document full of questions. It's not your medical exam, but it's a microscopic look at your institution and practices. Used by the lender, used by insurance company, and supposed to be used for yourselves as well. You're completing the first one for your museum, gallery, historic house, or wherever your venue is. Leave your successors a valuable document increasing the professionalism of your place of employment. If you are merely updating one that is in place, pat yourself on the back. Again, it's only a document. Yes, possibly grueling to complete, but once done, the hard work is behind you. I hope that once you've done one, you'll have a better sense of the undertaking of our predecessors decades ago, who strove to determine and decide what were the important questions needing to be asked, and as a result, provided us with the first standard facility report, which has grown and been approved upon up through now and will continue to be so. Thank you. And now I turn it back to Sebastian.
Next slide, please, Caitlin. So I'm going to rush through the last couple of slides here. I do want to thank Hallie and Darlene for what they said, and all those updates in the history and everything there. It was so great to hear. We didn't go over everything, but we want people to know that we did scour the whole document looking for edits to make it easier for people to fill. As Hallie said, It can be a whole team of people filling this out, but it can also be a single person who's never done this before. So you want to make it accessible by a great number of people. But we do want to reiterate that this is a tool. Yeah, this is not something that AAM is going to be policing how you fill out a general facility report. If at any time you have a question about how to fill out one of the questions, it is best to speak to your lender. Your lender will let you know what it is that they want to know, and they will let you know how best to answer some of those questions. So, for example, temperature and humidity, and other kinds of questions. So you can contact AAM, but it'd be best to contact your lender if you're working with one. Next slide, please. There are other revisions we want to see. I don't know how we forgot to add tribal museums to this one. I am extremely embarrassed about that. But as you can see, there are a couple of revisions that we want to work on in the future. One, we want to make it shorter. It wasn't possible this time. We did one attempt at it with the supplemental questions section. We want to turn this into multiple languages. There was a question in the question and answer about the UK museums. We did have someone from the UK look at this because they're going to take our version and incorporate it into the UK's updated version. So this does not take the place of the UK form. They're just using it for their own purposes. We would like to turn this into Spanish. We would like to turn this into French, and working with whomever to turn it into whatever languages are available. Next slide, please. Again, I'm going to remind you that the form is available at the AAM bookstore. When I just went on there a couple minutes ago, it is on sale. So if you are a member, it's actually $9.95 as opposed to $19.95. So if you're a member, go there and download it. And we'll share the link is shared in the chat as well. Next slide. So I want to thank Darlene and Hallie for joining us today and giving us so much wonderful information. Thanks to them and the other editors as well for their contributions to the form itself. It was much needed and greatly appreciated. We also need to thank AAM and Dean Phyllis specifically for their support to this work. If you have any questions, you can contact us at our emails and also go to the AAM website or Collection Stewardship website. I'm going to take a second to answer some questions that showed up there. So there's a question if we get free updates for a period of time. I don't know how AAM works. Generally, they do a single version that's the 2008 version, the 2020 version, possibly 2030 version. I don't think they're in the habit of doing 2.2, 2.3, or so on. So I cannot speak for AAM and say if we were able to update this now by adding tribal museums, could you get the updated one? So I cannot speak for AAM on that one. Question about additional spaces if you need to fill out the GFR. Again, that is a question between you and the lender. If you're going to use those offsite warehouse spaces for either the art or for the crates, some museums want to know where you're storing your crates. So you can duplicate some of those questions that they are asking in the form, and then talk to your lender if you need to. Again, this is not something that AAM has the capacity or interest to police what people are how people are filling out the form. So I think that is all the questions that we have in the question and answer form. We are just at about time. We can take a look at the chat. Darlene, Hallie, any final words from either of you?
I think, Sebastian, in so much of the reading I've done over the years, there is a Spanish GFR that was produced decades ago, but I have not seen a copy of it yet. So if anyone in the audience does have a copy, please send it along to Sebastian. It would be good to have something to work from, and get it updated at some point when AAM would be interested in helping us do that.
Thank you, Darlene. And I am in touch with some people who do want to make the new edit into Spanish or translate into Spanish. So we just need to get the AAM's approval to do so. We just haven't gone there yet.
Great.
Thank you, Darlene. Hallie, any final words?
Just that if anyone has any questions for any of us, please put our contact information into your browser and just email us. We are happy to answer any questions that you guys may have or assist in any hiccups you may come across when completing this.
This webinar will be, it has been recorded. We're going to put this up on our YouTube page and linked on our collection stewardship website. We also will be linking the webinar from Tuesday on the museum registration methods #6. Be on the lookout. Collection Stewardship will be hosting other webinars in the coming months. They are very popular. But we are after 4 o'clock, so I want to thank Hallie, Darlene, and Caitlin for all their help on this presentation. I want to thank everybody who tuned in to listen to us speak. Hopefully this has been useful, and hopefully the new form is going to be something that all of you can use and are happy with. There will always be edits. It can't be a perfect document, but we're striving for that. If you have any edits, if you have any suggestions, please go ahead and email us. We're always happy to chat about this. So thank you everybody so much, and I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
I think it is just us four now, so